In just 6 seconds, a crippled street beggar named Isa took a bullet, saved the president, and triggered a national uprising. But why was a man who could barely walk the only one brave enough to stand? The sun hung heavy over Republic Square, like a loaded rifle, its glare bleaching the cracked concrete below. Heat waves shimmered across the sea of bodies, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their backs damp, their faces taut. The square, once a place of marching bands and ceremonial flags, now felt like a ticking heart, too loud, too full. Over 8,000 people had gathered that morning. Vendors had cleared out by sunrise. Security officers paced the rooftops. Drones hovered like vultures. But still the people came. Mothers with sleeping babies tied to their backs. Young men gripping signs that read, "Clean hands, clean country." Elderly veterans who had seen too many regimes rise and rot. They had not come for entertainment. They had come for one man, President Ibrahim Traoré. He wasn't just a politician today. He was a question mark standing on the edge of a sentence the whole country was holding its breath to finish. Backstage, Traoré adjusted the lapel of his ash-gray suit. He was a tall man, not imposing, but steady like a tree that had survived many storms. His aides buzzed nervously behind him, whispering about talking points and optics. But Traoré heard none of it. In his chest was the briefcase, not the one in his hand, but the one inside his soul, heavy with reforms that could either save his people or bury him politically. His fingers trembled, just slightly, but he masked it by tightening his tie. Then he stepped forward. As he emerged onto the stage, a hush fell, not total silence, but the kind of collective inhale that happens before a nation jumps or crashes. The wind stopped. Even the birds seemed to perch and listen. He raised a hand, not for show, for steadiness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice firm but not loud, "today is not a day for me. It is a day for us, for every street child, for every farmer left behind, for every man who," and then a twitch, not on stage, in the crowd, near the outer perimeter, behind a cluster of leaning vendors' carts and 2 blue and white umbrellas, a man in a faded jacket stood too still. His face was shadowed by a cheap baseball cap, sweat crawling down his neck. His right hand trembled, not from the heat, but from the weight of the pistol hidden beneath his shirt. He was murmuring to himself. Not prayers, not hesitation, just numbers. 1, 2, 3. Breathe. Breathe. His name didn't matter. His face wasn't known, but his presence was about to rupture the future of a nation. Unbeknownst to the people around him, a second figure watched the same spot just a few meters away, nearly buried in the crowd. A man on crutches, one pant leg empty, his eyes sharp beneath the dirt and wear of street life. No name tag, no entourage. Just one eye scanning the movement, the twitch, the rhythm of a hand that didn't belong in the crowd. Issa Kabor had seen hands like that before. In the mines, in the wars, in the streets where men didn't talk much because killing didn't need speeches. And now that same kind of hand was gripping steel beneath cotton. Back on the stage, Traoré's voice continued, now rising with purpose. He had reached the part about ending the corporate mining contracts, about taxing the untouchable rich, about placing land rights back into the hands of indigenous families. People began nodding, cheering, but one hand among thousands tightened its grip on the pistol. Issa's breath slowed, not from fear but from clarity. He looked at the man, then at the stage, then at the briefcase in Traoré's hand, and he moved. No one saw it coming because no one expected a man with one leg and rusted crutches to lunge. But he did, and the air cracked. A gunshot, a scream, a ripple across Republic Square like a stone tossed into the soul of a nation. And there in that single second the story truly began. The crack of the gun tore through the air like it was ripping the sky in half. There was no warning, no countdown. 1 second President Traoré was speaking about dignity and land, and the next a sharp thunderclap shattered everything. People didn't even scream at first. They froze, trying to understand if it was real, if maybe it was just fireworks or a microphone shorting out. But then they saw him, the man with the crutches, the one who shouldn't have been able to move quickly, the one most of them had stepped around that morning, thinking he was another broken figure of the streets. That man was now airborne, his whole body twisted mid-lunge, his rusted crutch barely keeping up as if trying to catch him before gravity did. And then he dropped. There was a sound not unlike a heavy sack of sand slamming against stone. Then a scream. Then 10,000 screams. The president was still standing stunned, but Issa Kabor lay in a heap at his feet. Blood spread too fast, too bright, soaking into the concrete like a message. The president's security team rushed him, but Traoré shoved them aside. He dropped to his knees. "Medic!" someone shouted. "Down, get him down!" another voice barked. But Traoré was already reaching forward. His hand trembling hovered over Issa's chest, where the wound bled in heavy pulses. The bullet had torn through his left shoulder, angled just enough to have missed Traoré's heart by inches. "Stay with me," the president muttered, as if he could will the man's soul to remain. Issa coughed, weak but conscious. Blood touched the edge of his lips. His face was pale, the skin around his eyes waxy and tight. But his expression was calm, strangely calm for a man dying on public stone beneath the president of a nation. "It's not you they fear," Issa rasped, each word carved from pain. "It's what you're about to do." Traoré blinked. "What do you mean?" But Issa didn't answer. His eyes rolled back for a moment, then refocused. His body trembled once, then again, like it was trying to reject the bullet still burning inside. Around them, Republic Square was chaos. People scattered in every direction, flags trampled, sandals lost, children sobbing. A woman collapsed from shock. Sirens wailed from 3 sides of the Capitol. The smell of cordite hung in the heat, bitter and raw. But in that circle of stillness where the wounded lay, and the president knelt beside him, there was a different kind of quiet. Not fear, something closer to reckoning. Traoré grabbed Issa's hand. It was rough, thick with old scars and work. A miner's hand, a fighter's hand, not the hand of a vagrant, not really. "You saved me," Traoré whispered, but Issa's lips curled not into a smile but something sharper. "I saved what's in the case," he said. Only then did the president glance at the briefcase lying beside the podium, now scratched and blood-flecked. No one else had touched it. No one had even thought about it in the chaos. But Issa had. Security tried to pull Traoré back again, but he shook his head. "I want him in the presidential wing. No media, no arrest, no name released. But sir, he took a bullet for me. He's not a suspect. He's a warning." As medics lifted Issa's limp form onto a stretcher, the crowd's panic had begun to morph into something else. People stared from behind overturned benches and lampposts, unsure whether what they just witnessed was terror or sacrifice. No one knew who the man was. Not yet, but they would. And by the time they found out, everything would change. The room was quiet, too quiet for the kind of day it had been. In the private wing of the presidential palace, President Traoré sat alone in a high-backed chair made of aged mahogany. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and leather, but his thoughts were tangled somewhere between blood on the concrete and the rasp in a dying man's voice. In front of him sat the briefcase scratch-stained with a smear of dried red, the brass lock glinting like an eye that never blinked. He hadn't opened it during the chaos. It had remained at his side as his guards shouted, as his aides panicked, as the nation began to shake under the weight of confusion and fear. But now in this sealed room, away from questions and cameras, Traoré clicked the lock open. Inside, no gun, no secret ledger, just a stack of printed papers, official-looking, each stamped with government seals. He flipped through them quickly, scanning the titles. At first glance, they seemed unremarkable: Proposal Revised National Mining Charter Amendment, Anti-Corruption Judiciary Oversight Act, Draft Bill Community Resource Redistribution Initiative. Dry language. Bureaucratic ink. But the deeper he read, the more it burned. These weren't just reforms. They were ruptures. Direct rewrites of the mining contracts that had stood for decades, contracts that siphoned resources to foreign conglomerates, while locals bathed in dust. The proposed clauses stripped automatic renewals, introduced tax accountability, and most dangerously granted land ownership to native communities whose names had never appeared in a ledger before. Entire districts that had belonged to corporations would now be under communal rule. The Anti-Corruption Act was sharper. It dismantled immunity for ministers, froze assets during investigations, and allowed for citizen-led review councils. No one in power was safe under these clauses, not even his own allies. He set the last document down with a slow breath. His eyes drifted not to the papers, but to the smear of blood on the inside lining of the case. The case Issa had died protecting. That's when the clarity hit him, not with panic, but with cold precision. They didn't want him dead. They wanted this to disappear. If Traoré had been assassinated on stage, the documents would have been declared under review by interim officials, quietly removed, buried under red tape. The public would never see them. No scandal, no martyr. Just a seamless reset to the status quo. The perfect kill wasn't of the man, it was of the idea. Issa hadn't just saved him. He had exposed the target. And now, holding those pages, Traoré finally saw the scope of the war he had walked into. The hallway smelled of alcohol and false hope. President Traoré walked silently between two plainclothes guards. His suit jacket was gone, his tie loosened. No entourage, no press. Only a nurse nodded at him with wide, uncertain eyes before disappearing down the corridor. This visit wasn't scheduled. It wasn't supposed to exist. Room 2104B. The blinds were drawn. Machines beeped softly in the corner, one out of rhythm. In the bed, Issa Kabor lay motionless except for his chest rising and falling beneath thin hospital sheets. His face was paler than before, drained not just by blood, but by years. Years that had settled in the lines around his eyes like dust in forgotten corners. Traoré stepped closer. He wasn't sure what he expected. Gratitude, weakness, silence. He got none of those. Issa's voice broke the stillness before the president could speak. You shouldn't be here. Traoré blinked. You took a bullet for me. I took a bullet for something bigger than you. Issa said, his tone soft but sharp like a knife under a napkin. And I'm still waiting to see if it was worth it. There was no disrespect in his words, just fatigue, the kind born not from pain, but from disappointment. Traoré sat at the edge of the bed, ignoring the protesting creak. Who are you really? Issa turned his head slowly, revealing eyes that had once burned bright, but now simmered with something else. No one. Officially. The president frowned. I was an analyst for the Ministry of Resource Oversight. 9 years ago, Issa continued. I had a desk, a badge, a pension plan I'd never see. I filed one report that showed a discrepancy in a mining contract with a firm based in Luxembourg. What kind of discrepancy? Land that didn't exist, profits that did, and a signature from someone who was already dead. Issa coughed a dry, tearing sound. They told me to fix it. I thought they meant correct it, but they meant erase it. Traoré listened without blinking. I didn't erase it, Issa said. I filed it to oversight, and that's when I stopped existing. You were fired, I was disappeared. They pulled my records, claimed I was mentally unwell. 2 weeks later, I was hit by a vehicle. No investigation. Just a note from the ministry saying, case closed. That's how I lost the leg. Traoré felt his fingers curling unconsciously, and since then I became what they expected, a ghost. Issa looked away. Until you picked up that case, until you spoke about giving land back to people who've only ever had dust in their mouths, Traoré leaned forward, voice low. Why risk your life for someone you didn't know? Issa's eyes met his again, steady. Because I knew the documents. I knew the names. And I knew you'd be dead before sunset if I didn't act. A long silence hung between them. Not awkward, just heavy. Traoré finally said, I want you protected. Not just medically, legally, visibly. Issa shook his head. Visibility is a death sentence. They don't fear me. They fear what I remember. But if we hide you, we lose the witness. You won't need a witness if you speak first. What do you mean? Issa turned toward him fully now. Tell the people, not just that I saved you, but why. Tell them what's in the briefcase. Tell them who's profiting. Say the names before they erase you too. Traoré exhaled slowly. He had faced generals, foreign ambassadors, and billionaires in silence. But this man, broken and bedridden, had just challenged him more than any of them. He stood. Rest. I'll return. Issa's voice followed him to the door. Just don't return too late. The room was dimmer this time. Outside the hospital window, dusk stretched across the capital like an old bruise. Traoré sat quietly beside Issa's bed, a small recorder in his hand, but it remained off. What he wanted wasn't for the record. It was for understanding. Issa's voice came slowly, not because of pain, but because memory was heavier than blood loss. I was born in Tangafa, west of the hills. Nothing there but red soil and silence. We mined before we could read. My father died coughing up stones. My mother followed 2 winters later. He didn't blink as he spoke, eyes fixed on the ceiling. I joined the rebel forces at 16. Not for politics, just hunger. They promised boots, food, and a weapon. They gave us 1 meal a day and taught us how to kill for the next. Traoré said nothing. He let the silence hold. We fought for something once, or at least we thought we did. When the mining companies moved in, the soil turned black. Rivers died, and we, those born in dust, were told to leave it behind or die in it. A long pause. I chose wrong. Led a raid on a government convoy. There were children inside. I didn't know. They made sure I would remember. Issa shifted, slightly wincing, but his voice didn't waver. 5 years in a concrete box. No windows. No trial. Just cold metal and a name no one said aloud. They didn't just break my body in there. They made me invisible. His hand brushed the sheet fingers, twitching as if grasping something no longer there. When I got out, I had 1 leg, no documents, no home. I begged. Not because I wanted to, but because ghosts don't get jobs. They just haunt. Traoré leaned forward, expression unreadable. And then he asked gently. Issa's jaw tightened. Then I heard it. He took a breath deeper this time, more alive now. 2 weeks ago. Market in Zone 3. I was digging through discarded fish bones when I heard French, fluent but wrong. Military cadence. Precise. Mercenaries, Traoré asked. Issa nodded. They weren't buying. They were watching. 2 men by the spice, stands one with a comm in his ear. They mentioned your name twice, then le dossier de réforme and le plan. One of them laughed and said, he doesn't make it to Thursday. The words hung like smoke. I followed them, Issa added, for 4 days. Slept on rooftops, listened, learned. They weren't just contractors. They were ex-Foreign Legion, paid in crypto, flown in quiet. Local police never knew. He coughed, a wet sound this time. They thought no one would see them. No one ever does. Not beggars, not cripples. But I saw. Traoré's face darkened. You risked everything, he said. Why not tell the police? Issa almost laughed. What police? The ones guarding your assassin's paycheck? He turned his head again to meet Traoré's eyes. I didn't save you because I believed in you. I saved you because you're the last thing standing between them and silence. They don't want a dead president. They want a blind country. The room fell into stillness. Machines beeped on. The recorder in Traoré's hand remained off. Finally, Issa looked away and whispered, You have no idea how loud the world gets when no one sees you. Traoré stood, his hands clenched, not in anger, but in understanding. I see you now, he said. Issa closed his eyes. Then don't look away. The presidential palace was never truly quiet. Even in the dead hours past midnight, the walls breathed. Guards exchanged coded signals over earpieces. Lights buzzed softly above polished marble. And somewhere, always, someone was watching someone else. President Traoré sat in his private study with the door locked and the curtains drawn. The room smelled of old paper, oil ink, and something sharper doubt, not in himself but in those around him. He replayed Issa's final words over and over. Your enemies don't wear uniforms. They sign your paychecks. That line didn't leave him. It haunted meetings, echoed in greetings, clung to every handshake. And now when he looked at his own inner circle, he didn't see advisors. He saw masks. He noticed it first in General Tano. 2 days after the attempt, Tano's report on the gunman had arrived, sealed but suspiciously thin. No confirmed identity. No weapon recovered. No known associates, just a vague conclusion, lone radical. Traoré had known Tano for years, trusted him with matters of life and state, but the general's eyes no longer met his. His answers came too quickly, too rehearsed. His silence in certain meetings spoke louder than protocol. Then there was Minister Diawara, head of economic development. She had once championed reform loudly, passionately. But now she deflected every question about foreign contracts with bureaucratic fog. She offered condolences for the attack, but never asked if Traoré was truly safe. The walls had begun to crack, not from bombs, but from breath-heavy hidden watching. So Traoré acted, quietly. He had the blueprints of the palace rescanned, old security cameras cross-checked with internal logs, access permissions audited in reverse tracing, who entered, where, when, and for how long. At night, he walked the corridors alone, listening not just for footsteps, but for silence where there should have been none. In the data room beneath the West Wing, he found a hardline server, one supposedly decommissioned years ago, still active. It routed only one type of file: financial records, and it was accessed most recently by someone using admin-level clearance under the name Sahel 74. That wasn't anyone he knew. He ordered it traced. No one could explain how it got back online. Or rather, they explained too much too quickly in ways that didn't align. The palace had holes, not the kind made by bullets but by loyalty, and these holes bled power. For the first time since taking office, Traoré realized he might be sitting on a throne carved from compromise and maintained by people who had never wanted change, only control. And he began to write names, not aloud, not on digital files, but by hand on paper. A list of those who smiled too easily, those whose wealth grew too fast, those whose calendars never overlapped with transparency meetings. He didn't know who had tried to kill him, not yet, but he knew where they were hiding, right here, within the walls, and now he would make the palace see them. The arrest happened quietly just after dawn in a hallway lined with glass maps of the provinces. No alarm was sounded, no public statement, only 3 guards, 1 encrypted command, and a locked conference room beneath the West Wing. The general didn't resist. General Idris Tano, decorated veteran national hero, guardian of the capital during the insurgency years, walked between his captors like a man headed to a funeral he'd already attended in his mind. His face was unreadable. No fury, no shame, just silence. President Traoré waited alone at the table when they brought him in. No aides, no legal counsel, just the president and the man who had once pinned a medal to his chest after their first electoral victory. They didn't speak for a long moment. Then Traoré gestured toward the seat across from him. Tano sat. On the table between them was a single folder, not thick but heavy with implication. Inside were timestamps, security clearances, communications intercepted between encrypted lines. The digital trail had led through 3 intermediaries before circling back to a single code signature, Sahel 74. Tano's clearance. Traoré didn't speak right away. He opened the folder slowly, laid it flat, and looked the general in the eye. Tano blinked once, then looked down at his own hands. Steady, precise hands that had once drawn military maps in red ink and gunpowder dust. "You're trying to free us," Tano said, voice low. "They're trying to own us." Traoré said nothing. "They promised me stability," the general continued. "Not wealth, not exile, just order. A seat at the table when the dust settled. A chance to keep this country breathing even if it meant we didn't stand." "And you believe them?" Traoré asked quietly. Tano exhaled through his nose. "I believe that if you went ahead with your reforms, they'd turn the country into ash, that they'd flood our borders with weapons and call it humanitarian aid, that they'd bankrupt the treasury with economic sanctions and then offer loans at a cost." He looked up. "You weren't supposed to survive the stage." Traoré's fingers twitched, but his face remained still. "You weren't supposed to open that briefcase," Tano added. "And if you did, you weren't supposed to understand what was inside. And yet here we are." "Yes," Tano said, "here we are." Traoré leaned back. "Who else?" Tano hesitated just enough. "I gave no names," he said, "only summaries, schedules, hints about the security shifts. I thought, if they did it clean, if they made it look like a lone wolf, maybe it would all pass quietly. Maybe no one else had to die." He paused, but someone did. Issa. The name wasn't spoken, but it hung thick in the room. "I never meant for blood," Tano whispered. "That's the problem," Traoré said. "You thought there was any version of this where no one bled." He stood. His voice dropped, calm but colder now. "You once told me a leader must know when to sacrifice comfort for conviction. Today I ask you to remember your own words." Tano nodded slowly. "What happens now?" "You're not going to prison," Traoré said. "Not yet." Tano's brow lifted. "You'll remain under house watch, monitored, no contact with the outside. But you will write everything. Names, meetings, timelines. You will tell the truth you tried to bury. And then we'll see if the country has room for a man who betrayed it in fear, but tried in the end to stop bleeding. For the first time in years, Tano looked small, not defeated, just human. As the guards returned to escort him away, he stopped at the door and turned. "They're not done," he said. "This wasn't the first hole in the palace. It was the smallest." Then he walked out, and Traoré knew the real war had only just begun. The hospital lights hummed above them, soft but constant. The room smelled like iodine and old sweat, but the tension had settled into something more focused, less fear, more purpose. Issa sat upright now. His eyes were sharper. The painkillers were wearing off, but he had refused more. "Clarity," he said, "is stronger than morphine." Across from him, President Traoré leaned in as Issa pulled a small cloth pouch from beneath the hospital mattress. It was wrapped in gauze and stained with dried blood. Inside, 3 cracked USB sticks and an old second-hand voice recorder tape, dented but alive. "I don't have spies," Issa began, "just ears." Traoré raised an eyebrow. "They never saw me," Issa said, "so I heard everything." The recorder clicked. A tinny playback hissed to life. "If the reform passes, we kill it in the markets first. Dump their currency, bleed them dry. He won't survive a 30% inflation week." The accent was French, fluent but colonial sharp R's and clipped vowels. Then another voice entered, cooler, precise. "Plan B is faster, safer. Non-lethal optics, but full destabilization. Get the street to rise before the vote. Use the mosque rumors. Weaponize the fuel queues." Traoré leaned forward. "Where did you get this bar on Avenue Kfouri?" Behind the soccer screen. 2 men. Too confident. Too drunk. One phone left on the table with a cracked mic. "I was sweeping up spilled peanuts." Another file. "American advisors are greenlighting logistics if plausible deniability holds. South African Shell will wire the funds." This time the voices were in English. One calm, measured, the other checking time zones. Issa's expression didn't change. "Mosque in Sector 8, he said. "They thought no one would sit near the clinic crates." "I sat inside one for 4 hours. Not comfortable, but useful." Traoré sat back. The puzzle pieces he had held in his head, the mercenaries, the financial trails, the vague denials from the West, all began to realign. Sharper, angrier. These men, they were hired, Issa nodded. Contracted through 3 layers. None local. They fly in for 6 days, then disappear. Same pattern. But the accents don't lie, and neither does the money. He opened a final clip. "Static, then he's got a martyr now. That cripple. Could flip the whole sentiment. If that happens, we freeze media support, paint him as unstable, nationalist, isolate the narrative, starve the oxygen." Silence followed. Issa looked down at the recorder. Clinic waiting room, near the army base. 3 hours of pretending to sleep. He took a long breath as if confessing a secret no one had asked him to keep. "I've been listening for years. Not because I planned to use it, just because I needed to know why I was erased. Who made me vanish? I thought it would give me peace. It didn't." Traoré's jaw tightened. "But you kept recording." Issa nodded. "Because it stopped being about me. It started being about everything." He handed the devices across. "There's more. I hid backup drives in 5 cities, 1 under a burned church, 1 inside a broken fan at a youth center. The rest, I remember. Names, patterns, habits." Traoré weighed the pouch in his palm. It felt heavier than it looked. "This could spark a war," he said quietly. Issa looked at him unwavering. "It already has." There was no triumph in his voice, just truth. The briefcase sat on the desk like a live grenade, silent but waiting. Its matte leather was scuffed at the corners now, its brass locks dulled by blood and dust. Traoré stared at it without blinking, as if looking long enough might make it less dangerous. Inside, 32 pages of legislation that could rewrite the future. Also inside his death warrant. He paced slowly across his office, lights, dimmed curtains drawn. In the corners of the room, portraits of old leaders stared down from oil frames, some revolutionaries, others opportunists, but none who had faced what he now did. They had fought enemies with rifles. He was fighting ones with banks. The intel was clear. Issa's recordings, the intercepted memos, the frozen glances from cabinet members who once smiled too easily. Signing these reforms meant war. Not just political war, but systemic. Economic retaliation. Media smear campaigns. Assassination attempts disguised as malfunctions. He'd be painted as radical, isolated by the West, undermined by his own team. The streets were already dry. Fuel lines were growing. Children hadn't eaten in 2 days in the northern zone. And yet the decision waited in that briefcase. A knock. Issa entered, slowly, still limping, eyes sharper than ever. "You haven't signed," he said quietly. Traoré nodded. "Because signing means chaos. Not signing means betrayal. I sign it and they'll crush the economy. They're crushing it already. I sign it and they'll kill me." Issa stepped forward. "What if you don't sign and they kill you anyway?" The silence stretched. Traoré lowered his gaze to the desk. "I used to think justice was about fixing broken systems. Now I think it's just surviving inside them long enough to do one good thing." Issa's voice was steady. "Then do the one thing." Traoré sat. He opened the briefcase. The documents waited, unfolded, unredacted, undeniable. His pen hovered. "They've taken down presidents for less," he whispered. Issa exhaled. "Then don't die crawling." Traoré looked at him. There was no smile between them, no hope painted falsely across the moment. Just a question, and one answer. Issa's eyes didn't blink, then die standing. It began with a headline: "Crippled rebel leader identified in plot against state." The story broke just before sunrise, blasted across every major channel in the country. A grainy video clip played on loop. Issa Kabori, hunched over on his crutches, speaking into a megaphone to a group of masked men. The footage was shaky, the audio warped, but the words were clear enough to be damning. "They've stolen from us long enough. It's time to take it back by any means." The same clip aired with 5 different subtitles, 5 different contexts. One channel claimed it was filmed during a violent protest near the border. Another claimed it was taken inside a militia camp. A third said it was sourced from foreign intelligence partners. Within hours, social media caught fire. Issa the agitator. Radical cripple. Dash coup whisperer. By midday, commentary programs labeled him a domestic threat. Opposition ministers called for immediate arrest. Some demanded the death penalty. Others more subtly asked for a quiet resolution. By sunset, Issa Kabore was in handcuffs. They came for him at the hospital, not in secret but in spectacle. 15 armed officers, body armor, flashing lights, cameras ready. He didn't resist. He only asked to speak with the president. They refused. Traoré watched it all unfold from his office. He had ordered no arrest, gave no approval. But the judiciary, the Ministry of Interior, and the National Intelligence Directorate all claimed emergency powers. The system had moved without him, or worse, around him. He called every agency head. They deflected. The video speaks for itself, Mr. President. The nation must be protected. This is what leadership demands. He demanded the original files. The metadata had been wiped. He demanded a forensic report. It was still processing. He demanded a meeting with Issa. They told him Issa was in a secure location awaiting enhanced interrogation. And then came the second wave: doctored images of Issa holding an assault rifle. A voice message clearly spliced where he supposedly threatened to burn the palace down. Edited photos placing him at past riots. Fabricated testimony from unnamed sources claiming he once sold maps to insurgents. The machine was in full motion now. Traoré stood before his advisors the next morning. None looked surprised. A few looked relieved. "You realize this man took a bullet meant for me," he said evenly. Silence. "He's not a terrorist." One minister cleared her throat. "Perception, sir, is often more powerful than truth." Another added, "The nation needs unity. Arresting him protects your reform. It buys you time." Traoré stared at them. "No, it buys you comfort. It buys the system continuity. It sells out a man who gave up everything." They didn't answer. They didn't need to. Traoré left the room. He returned to the briefcase still open on his desk and ran his fingers across the edge of the final reform bill. They had turned the man who saved his life into a public enemy, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he symbolized exposure. And symbols are dangerous, especially the ones that can't be killed cleanly. The courtroom was colder than expected. High marble walls, rows of press cameras like blinking red insects. Soldiers lined the perimeter, rifles held across chests motionless. A digital screen overhead projected the national flag flickering slightly, as though unsure it still belonged here. Issa Kabor was brought in through the side wearing a gray tunic too large for his frame. The crutches were gone. They had given him a wheelchair metal cold with wheels that squeaked each time he shifted. The cuffs on his wrist clinked against the armrest like punctuation marks to a sentence he hadn't spoken yet. The judge entered with formality thick enough to crush bone. She didn't look at Issa. No one did. This wasn't a trial. It was theater. The charges were read quickly, each one echoing in the sterile chamber. Conspiracy to incite rebellion. Collaboration with armed dissidents. Treason against the Republic. The prosecution rolled out their evidence with performative efficiency video clips, voice recordings without metadata, bank statements from accounts that didn't exist a month ago. A photo of Issa next to a burned-out van. A statement from a militia defector who never appeared in person. Every piece of evidence was designed not to prove guilt, but to drown innocence. Traoré watched from a private feed. He had tried to intervene the day before issuing an order to delay proceedings. It was ignored. Separation of powers, they had told him. Interference will damage your image. What image he had wanted to scream? The one they photoshopped for me. In the courtroom, the judge turned to Issa. You have the right to enter a plea. Issa didn't blink. Silence. Mr. Kabor. Still silent, the judge leaned forward. Will you plead guilty or not guilty? Issa's voice when it came was soft but clear. I plead nothing. A murmur rippled through the press section. The judge narrowed her eyes. That is not an option under this court's protocol. Issa turned his head, scanning the room. Slowly, cameras, soldiers, judges' aides, all of them watching but not seeing. You call me a traitor, he said. Silence. He leaned forward in his chair, hands still cuffed. Look at the ones signing oil contracts in hotels you won't name. Look at the bank accounts opened by ministers who haven't paid taxes in 20 years. Look at the men building private roads through farmland they don't own. You want a criminal? He tapped his own chest. I'm the distraction. They're the disease. The judge banged the gavel once. Order. But Issa's voice cut through it. You want a sentence? Fine. Sentence me. Call me dangerous. Call me broken. Just don't call this justice. The guards rolled him back before he could say more. Outside headlines ran wild. Kabori's outburst confirms extremist leanings trial, interrupted by propaganda speech. President remains silent amid scandal. But in the back alleys of the city, in tea houses and schoolyards, it was a different line that echoed. Don't call this justice. It spread like a whisper first, then a murmur, then a chant. And the court built to silence. One man had accidentally amplified him. The courtroom was not expecting him. No entourage, no podium, no cameras warned in advance. Just the echo of polished shoes on marble as President Traoré walked through the double doors, unguarded, unannounced, and utterly alone. The gavel froze midair. The judge's hand trembled slightly as she set it down. Prosecutors leaned back. Guards stiffened. The journalists blinked rapidly, as if unsure whether to keep filming or stand. And Issa, shackled to his chair, blinked once, then tilted his head in quiet disbelief. Traoré didn't look left or right. He walked straight toward the witness box and stood there tall but unsheltered. I was not summoned to speak, he said, but I am the only reason this man is here. A breathless hush fell over the chamber. Traoré turned to Issa. He saved me. That's what they said in the headlines. But that's not the full truth. He paused. He didn't just save my life. He saw what I refused to see: a system built to erase men like him, to profit from silence, to label truth as extremism. He looked at the judge now. And I let them do it. Gasps rippled like wind through dry leaves. The defense lawyer, until now relegated to ceremonial silence, straightened suddenly. The prosecution looked pale. Traoré continued, his voice steady. He warned me. He gave me proof. I ignored it until it was almost too late. I wanted to keep the country calm, to keep the markets happy. But what is peace if it's built on lies? The judge finally spoke cautious. Mr. President, this is highly irregular. Trayer raised a hand. So is a courtroom where justice takes direction from fear. He looked back to Isa. You never asked to be a symbol, but they made you one. And today I refuse to be silent. He stepped back. I will face the consequences of what I failed to stop. But let the world know this man is not a traitor. He's the mirror we've all refused to look into. The judge looked frozen. No sentence was read, no order given. The room collapsed into noise. Outside, the shockwave traveled fast. News stations scrambled to confirm the footage. Social media split in half. One half roared in approval, hashtags exploding with "Want Trayer spoke" and "Rush, free Issa now." The other half boiled in rage, accusing the president of betrayal, weakness, of kneeling to chaos. In the North, students marched. In the East, ministers resigned. In the West, oil prices spiked. In the Capitol, flags burned, and flags waved sometimes on the same street. But in a small hospital cell now turned into a holding chamber, Issa Kabor sat still, smiling. The room was silent, not the courtroom, not a parliament floor, but the national broadcast studio. Cameras stood ready. Technicians checked audio feeds. Trayer sat alone under the lights, not behind a podium, but at a simple desk. No flags, no anthem, just one microphone, and beside him, a box of tapes. He didn't look into the lens at first. He looked down, steadying his hands. Tonight, he began. I speak not as your president, but as a man who has been lied to, and who lied by remaining silent. The airwaves reached every home in the country. Markets paused. Public buses stopped moving. Bars turned down their music. In prison cells in farmland, huts in city cafes, eyes turned to the screens. Trayer held up one of the tapes. This, he said, is the voice of the people who tried to own us. He pressed play. Static. Then once the reform is signed, we push the protests. No fuel for 10 days. Let the public starve, they'll blame him, not us. A French accent, clinical and cold. A new clip, Sahel mining will match the bribe. Just make sure the environmental clause disappears by Thursday. A voice in English this time. Male. American. Confident. Laughter in the background. Another, the cripple is a liability. If he speaks again, we have options. Permanent ones. South African accent. Calm. Calculated. Trayer didn't flinch. This is what colonization sounds like in 2025, he said, eyes now locked on the camera. Not with ships, not with chains, but with contracts, hunger, and silence. He let the next clip run without commentary. Trayer doesn't know half his cabinet's on payroll. Keep him alive, he's useful. Dead martyrs create waves. We want obedience, not headlines. He paused the tape. My fellow citizens, you were never the enemy, but you were always the target. His voice trembled but didn't break. Issa Kabor risked everything to make sure these voices were not lost. I ignored him. Then I watched him be framed, beaten, and nearly erased. He opened a folder, one holding the classified oil agreements, foreign infrastructure deals, private military contracts, each stamped with initials from his own ministers. I am releasing these documents in full tonight. If you burn them, they'll only multiply. If you deny them, we'll read them aloud. If you fear them, you're finally awake. Outside, the city shifted. Crowds began forming, not in rage this time, but in awe, in shock, in long overdue recognition. Trayer leaned in. This is not an uprising. It is an unmasking. One final clip. No one listens to beggars. That's why we can talk near them. The irony landed like a thunderclap. Issa listened, Trayer said, and now the whole world will. When he ended the broadcast, there were no fireworks, no applause, just a moment of stillness. But it was the kind that comes before an earthquake. The tanks rolled in before dawn. No warning, no press release, no insignia on the sides. Just matte green armor grinding through the boulevards of the Capitol, accompanied by the sharp bark of shortwave radios and boots thudding in unison. Above, two helicopters circled the city like vultures looking for a fresh kill. Trayer had been awake all night. He watched the satellite feed in silence as armored divisions moved past Parliament Hill, past the broadcasting center, and toward the civilian districts. None of them had requested orders. None had notified the presidency. This wasn't coordination, it was declaration. The generals had moved. They hadn't liked the broadcast, not the tapes, not the documents. Certainly not the mention of names, especially theirs. By 6 a.m., half the cabinet had disappeared from official channels. Embassies went dark. Local news stations replayed stock footage. Foreign outlets speculated. The people, however, did not wait for analysis. They poured into the streets, not with weapons but with pots, flags, and fists raised high. In every neighborhood, the chant grew like wildfire, Isa, Isa, Isa. Some painted his face on old cardboard. Others held up crutches, crossed like swords in the sky. A few simply marched barefoot just as Isa had once limped through the streets, invisible, unheard. At the military hospital, the mood was different. Isa was pulled from his bed without ceremony. Guards in tactical gear stormed the ward, ripped out the IVs, and shackled his wrist to a cold iron chain. His body sagged under the sudden pressure, but his eyes were steady. "Where are you taking me?" he asked. No one answered. They dragged him down the hallway, past terrified nurses through a back exit, and shoved him into an armored vehicle. Inside, a colonel sat waiting, face blank, rifle across his knees. "You talk too much," the colonel muttered. Isa smirked through the pain. "And you listen too little." Outside the hospital, a crowd had gathered. The moment the back doors of the vehicle opened, someone recognized him. A teenage boy yelled, "That's him!" Within seconds, the chant returned louder, more defiant. "Isa, Isa, Isa." The colonel's jaw clenched. Streets filled faster than they could clear. Grandmothers beat soup pots with wooden spoons. Taxi drivers honked in rhythm. Vendors climbed atop stalls, waving pieces of bread as banners. School children raised homemade signs. "Truth walks on crutches." Inside the armored car, Isa leaned forward. "They were afraid of a voice," he said, "and now they've given it 1,000 mouths." The colonel didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said everything. The people weren't watching anymore. They were marching. At noon, the sun hit Republic Square like a searchlight. The same stage where bullets once split the sky now stood empty, scarred by cracks and stained canvas. But this time, no sniper crouched in shadow. No barricade blocked the view. The square was open. Trayer walked into it alone. No motorcade. No bulletproof vest. No speech in his hands. Just his body exposed under the same sun as everyone else. He didn't say a word at first. Instead, he stepped forward past riot police, past reporters, past his own trembling aides. His shoes echoed against the stone, and each step rippled outward like a signal through still water. The people watched in silence. Then someone near the edge of the square stepped forward. A woman barefoot holding a wooden crutch high above her head, not as a tool, but as a banner. The crowd erupted. "The crutch is mightier. The crutch is mightier." The chant swelled like thunder, rolling through the lungs of the city. From rooftop to alley, from market stall to rooftop, it spread. And then the soldiers began to move. One by one, almost uncertainly, they lowered their rifles. Some dropped them completely. A young lieutenant in full armor looked at Trayer, at the crowd, then at the crutch raised skyward. He took off his helmet, placed it gently on the ground, and raised both hands into the air. Others followed. Soon the square wasn't a place of confrontation. It became a gathering. No one commanded it. No one choreographed it. But a movement took shape, one where guns fell silent and cymbals spoke louder than metal. Trayer reached the center of the square and turned to face the crowd. His voice, when it came, didn't need a microphone. "I have failed before," he said, "but I will not kneel to fear again. Today I stand with those who never stopped standing, even when they had nothing left to stand on." He looked toward the hospital where Isa had once leaned against the window in chains. "Today we lift up the man they tried to bury, and the truth they tried to erase." Someone handed Trayer a crutch, the same one Isa had dropped in the chaos days earlier. Trayer held it up high, not as a prop, but as a pledge. A hush fell again, and then a roar. Not just cheers, but a deep, guttural release, the kind a country makes when it's been choking for too long. From that moment on, it was no longer about one man. The crutch was no longer a symbol of weakness. It was proof that broken things could still hold weight and even carry a nation. By morning, the streets were louder than the tanks. Crowds spilled into intersections like rivers bursting through a dam. Flags waved from windows, crutches raised like spears. Graffiti bloomed overnight, bold letters on walls. Buses, bridges, dignity walks again. But in the military high command, the silence was deafening. The generals had overplayed their hand. The footage of Traer standing with civilians holding up ISIS crutch had reached international broadcasts. Embassies froze support. Sanctions loomed. Whispers leaked from within colonels refusing orders. Entire regiments going dark. A general's daughter caught among protesters holding a sign. "My father does not speak for me." They called it a coup in the beginning. But coups don't survive when the streets flood. With love, not fear. By noon, the soldiers had retreated to barracks. Some slipped away in civilian clothes. Others left rifles behind on sidewalks like the corpses of old ideas. No shots were fired. No battles broke. No flags burned. The coup didn't die in blood. It died in silence. Inside the presidential palace, Traer stood at the same balcony from which he once waved to crowds during inauguration. This time he didn't wave. He listened. Below, thousands had gathered not in rage, but in readiness. He turned to the man beside him. Issa stood unaided. The bruises still painted his skin in purple and yellow. His eyes were sharper now, but his body carried the weight of 1,000 days unseen. "You gave them hope," Traer said. "I gave them what they already had," Issa replied. "They just forgot the sound of their own voice." Traer hesitated, then pulled from his pocket a document, an executive appointment. "I want you in the cabinet," he said. "We'll draft the new ethics reform together. I want you beside me when we rebuild this government." Issa didn't take the paper. He looked out at the crowd, then back to Traer. "I'm not built for offices," he said, "and I've had enough walls." Traer frowned. "But your voice, your insight, it belongs in power." Issa shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "Power isn't what I want. Dignity is." Traer looked at him, then at the paper in his hand. Slowly he folded it in two and placed it on the railing between them. "Then what will you do?" he asked. Issa breathed in deeply. "I'll walk. I'll listen. And I'll remind people that they matter until they no longer need reminding." Traer smiled faintly. "Then you'll still be leading." Issa didn't answer. He didn't need to. Down below, the crowd had begun a new chant. Not one born from anger or grief, but from memory. "We see each other. We see each other." In that chant was every minor silenced by dust. Every woman passed over in meetings. Every crippled body pushed out of frames. Every whisper ignored in favor of polished voices. Every Isa who ever walked unseen. Traer stepped back, letting the moment belong to them. Behind him, aides waited to draft new policies, security waited to rebuild protocols, and the world waited to see what would become of a nation that had just stood up. But for now, all Traer did was listen. To a city that had found its voice again. To a revolution that ended not in gunfire, but in the raising of a crutch. And the sound of a people remembering their worth. The alleyways smelled different now. Once they reeked of burning trash, rusted metal, and old oil spilled from broken carts. Now it was wet paint and soap. Somewhere nearby, someone was scrubbing a wall. Issa walked slowly, no crutch, his limp steady but unapologetic. Children ran past him in clean uniforms, their backpacks bouncing against thin spines. A boy with no shoes chased a paper airplane down a freshly patched road, laughing like the world had never burned. The slum hadn't vanished. The roofs still leaked. Some stalls still sold stale bread and promises. But something invisible had shifted. Eyes looked up now. Conversations weren't just about surviving, they were about next week. He passed an old man repainting the gate of a school. The man looked up and nodded. "No cameras today," the man asked. Issa smiled. "Just walking." The man smirked. "You walked this road when it was broken. Good to see you walk it now that it's healing." Issa didn't respond. He only kept walking. Near the old well where once people fought over muddy water, children now lined up in front of a solar pump. Clean water. No guards, no shoving. A girl filled her bottle, turned and froze when she saw him. You're the one from the posters." "Issa," he said softly. She grinned. "My mom said you used to be poor." "I still am," he laughed. She tilted her head. "Then why do people follow you?" He knelt down, slightly careful with his knees. "Because I didn't stop listening when they stopped talking." She blinked. That's it. That's enough. She nodded like she understood, though she didn't yet. But one day she would. At sunset, Issa stood beneath the same rooftop where he once slept back when dignity was a luxury and hope was for fools. Now there was a railing, a small solar light, even a potted plant. Footsteps behind him. Trayer joined him casual and rolled up sleeves without guards. They're rebuilding the clinics, he said. One will be named after you, Issa chuckled. Don't. Why not? Because names are easier to forget than work. Trayer leaned on the railing beside him. We've passed 12 reforms in 3 months. Corruption arrests, transparency bills, education funds. And yet I still feel like we've just begun. You have. Trayer looked at him, searching. What do you want, Issa? The question landed heavier than the sunset. Issa took his time before answering. I want, he said slowly, a future where no one like me is ever invisible again. Trayer exhaled. That's bigger than laws. It always was. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the hum of night markets below the distant laughter, the squeak of bicycles, and the soft, steady beat of a nation learning how to breathe on its own. Issa turned to go. Trayer called after him. Will you ever stop walking? Issa smiled, not turning back. Only when I don't have to. And with that, he disappeared down the staircase back into the streets, not as a symbol, not as a leader, but as a man walking toward a future he once thought he'd never live to see. The museum was quiet on weekdays, the kind of quiet that made every step feel like a question, every whisper like a confession. Marble floors reflected soft afternoon light, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. A girl wandered alone, no older than 11. Her school ID swung from a blue ribbon around her neck. Her classmates had moved on ahead, but she lingered near a glass case at the end of a dim hallway. The exhibit had no title. No fanfare, just a crutch. Wooden, scratched, slightly bent at the center, its rubber tip worn almost flat. It leaned alone against nothing inside the glass, a single spotlight catching the grain of its age. She stared at it for a long time. Behind her, a museum guide in a brown vest approached quietly. You're the only one who stopped here, he said gently. The girl didn't turn around. What is it? The guide smiled. That he said is the crutch of the man who reminded us how to stand. She blinked. Whose crutch? The guide nodded toward the small brass plaque beneath the glass. Object number 4563, a wooden mobility aid, belonged to Issa Kabori, civilian, listener, witness, catalyst. No statue requested. The girl frowned. Why no statue? He said. Statues are for people who want to be remembered, the guide replied. He wanted people to remember themselves. She tilted her head, thinking. But what did he do? The guide sat on the edge of a nearby bench, motioning for her to sit. He listened when no one else did. He spoke when others were too afraid. And when a bullet flew toward the president, he didn't run. He was a bodyguard. No, the guide chuckled. He was a beggar. The girl's eyes widened. But that's just how they saw him. What he really was a mirror. He showed the country what it had forgotten: dignity. The girl leaned closer to the glass. Why keep his crutch? Because he didn't want his face in marble. He wanted people to remember the feeling of standing up, even if it hurt. A beat passed. Did he ever become famous? The guide shook his head. Not in the way most people do. He refused cabinet seats. He never gave speeches. He walked neighborhoods instead, quietly, until one day he didn't walk anymore. Did he die? Yes, the guide said softly, but not before he changed everything. The girl was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, why do we fight wars if someone like him can do more just by walking? The guide exhaled. That's a question people older than me are still afraid to answer. The girl nodded solemnly. She reached out and placed her fingers against the glass, not to touch the crutch, but as if to feel the space around it. It looks heavy, she said. It was the guide whispered. But he carried more than that. She stepped back. As she turned to leave, she glanced one last time at the simple object inside the case. Not heroic, not polished, just used, trusted, real. Before she caught up with her class, she looked over her shoulder and asked, do you think I could carry something like that one day? The guide smiled. You already are. They didn't call it a ceremony. There were no marching bands, no cannons, no rows of officials in stiff suits reading hollow speeches. No golden ribbon to cut. Just morning light, a blue sky without a single cloud, and the quiet sound of children's laughter echoing through the newly painted courtyard. President Traer stood at the entrance to a school that hadn't existed a year ago. The bricks still smelled fresh, the blackboards unmarked. Around him were murals, vibrant, hand-painted walls that wrapped around every building. Not political slogans, not portraits of leaders, but people. An old woman holding bread in one hand and a book in the other. A teenage boy raising a bandaged fist, not in rage but in rhythm with a drum. And in the middle of it all, a small brown crutch. Not grand, not glowing, just there. No plaque, no title. Traer ran his fingers along the edge of a bench newly installed near a fig tree. Beneath it was a carved inscription in 3 languages: dignity is not given. It's remembered. This place used to be called Zone 3B, a number, a label on a dusty city planning map known more for gang violence, failed plumbing, and burned-out street lamps than anything else. It was Isa's home, or what passed for one back when sleeping on rooftops and under broken kiosks was part of life. Traer had passed through here only once in his youth, hidden behind tinted windows on his way to a political fundraiser. He remembered the smell, the silence, the way people didn't look up. Now they looked up and smiled. He took a breath and stepped onto the stage, a low platform made from recycled shipping pallets, decorated with cloth sewn by local mothers. No headlines today, he said into the modest mic. No orders from above. Just one truth spoken out loud. This place matters. A gentle applause rippled across the courtyard. Students in white shirts and sandals watched him curiously. Some whispered, one waved. Traer smiled and waved back. This neighborhood, he continued, will no longer carry a number. It will carry a name, a promise, a reminder. He looked out at the crowd and said the words slowly, letting them sink in. This is now the place of dignity. A teacher wept quietly into her scarf. A boy clapped too soon, then stopped, then clapped again, when everyone else did. No fireworks followed, no anthem. Only the soft beat of a hand drum, beginning from a corner, joined by the stomp of bare feet on stone. Traer stepped down and let the community reclaim its stage. As he walked away, a girl ran past him, her backpack bouncing, her book clenched tight in one hand. On the cover, written in pencil, "If they don't see me, I'll write until they do." He didn't know her name, but he recognized the fire. Behind him, laughter rose higher. Someone began painting a sunflower on the side of the clinic. No statues, no parades, just gardens, murals, schools, and memory blooming in silence. The baobab had stood there longer than the town. Its trunk was wide enough to hide 3 men behind it, its branches stretched out like arms, always ready to catch the sky. Children called it the giant, and old women swore the tree listened better than most husbands. On market days, people gathered in its shade, not for trade, but for stories. That's where Traer found him. Isa sat cross-legged in the dirt, back against the massive bark, eyes closed, breathing, as if he had all the time in the world. A dog lay beside him, tail thumping lazily against the roots. The breeze shifted the dust in little swirls around his sandals. Traer approached quietly, unsure whether to interrupt. He hadn't seen Isa in over 2 months. Not since the vote. Not since the crutch had been placed behind glass. Isa opened one eye. "You walk like a man with questions," he said, not moving. "I walk like a man with answers, and no one left to give them?" To Traer replied. Isa chuckled. "Then sit. We'll confuse each other." Traer lowered himself with a groan beside him. The tree's bark was rough, but the shade was perfect. Birds chirped overhead. Somewhere in the distance, someone sang while pounding millet. Traer took a breath, reached into his coat, and pulled out 3 things: a gold medal in a velvet box, a deed to a piece of land in the Highlands, and a banknote signed in his own hand. "I came to thank you," he said. Isa opened both eyes this time, looked at the items, didn't touch them. "Land money, shiny things. You've earned more than I could ever give." Isa shook his head, laughing softly. "I already have everything." Traer raised an eyebrow. "You do?" Isa gestured around to the breeze, to the sleeping dog, to the shade. "I have peace." The words fell like rain. Not loud, not dramatic. Just true. Trayer looked at the medal again, then quietly placed it back into the box. I thought you might want recognition. Something permanent. I don't need to be remembered, Issa said. I need people to remember what they carry, not what they lost. Trayer nodded slowly. You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in front of that bullet? Issa shrugged. Someone else might have. Maybe no one. Maybe the country would have burned. Maybe it would have bloomed anyway. Doesn't matter. I only did what was in front of me. They sat in silence. After a while, Issa asked, And you ever rest? Trayor smiled faintly. This might be the first time in years I stopped talking long enough to breathe. Feels strange, doesn't it? Feels like freedom. Issa leaned back, closing his eyes again. Then don't ruin it with more paperwork. Trayor laughed, not politely, not presidentially, but fully. When he stood to leave, he left the box and the deed on the ground. Issa didn't touch them. As Trayor walked away, Issa's voice followed him like the rustle of leaves. Tell them they don't need statues. Trayor paused. What should I give them instead? Issa's answer came like a whisper through wind. Stories they can walk into. The parade wasn't planned. There were no posters, no routes, no speeches. Just people. Families. Children on shoulders. Farmers with dust still on their boots. Mothers holding hands stained with soap from morning laundry. A steady stream of footsteps down the main avenue that once separated the palace from the slums. Trayor stood at the edge of the boulevard, not on a balcony, not behind a podium, just beside a lamppost dressed in linen unnoticed. That's how he wanted it. It had been a year since the last riot, 3 months since the final reform passed, 2 weeks since Issa quietly disappeared from the public eye, and still people walked. Not out of protest, not out of anger, but something quieter, something stronger. A child came into view. No more than 6, his shirt oversized sleeves flapping like wings. He held a flag, not a printed one, but hand-stitched frayed at the edges. A familiar brown cross over a deep red field. The same design once painted on Issa's satchel. The boy gripped it tightly, dragging the cloth just above the pavement, his bare feet tapping the stones with a rhythm as old as the land. Trayer's breath caught in his throat. Behind the child came no drums, no slogans, just more people. Walking, laughing, living. And somehow, with every step, they seemed to say the same thing. We remember. The boy passed Trayer without a glance. But for a moment, the president saw something more. The way the child's back was straight, the way his eyes searched ahead, not downward. And in that, Trayer didn't see a symbol or a movement. He saw a future. The camera crews weren't there. No one would write this into the textbooks. But the ground, the same ground Issa once limped across, was full of memory. And then, without warning, it began to rain. Soft at first, barely enough to chase the dust. But Trayer stayed still. And in the sound of the droplets meeting stone, he heard it. A voice. Not loud, not divine, just familiar. A whisper that rose from the earth as if spoken by the very footprints still fresh along the boulevard. He never wanted to be remembered, but the ground remembers every step of a man who refused to kneel. Trayer closed his eyes and listened. There are stories that roar and stories that whisper. The man who refused to kneel is a whisper that echoes louder than most revolutions. It reminds us that change doesn't always come from those with microphones or armies, but sometimes from a man with a broken body and an unbroken spirit. Issa Kabori is not your typical hero. He doesn't lead armies. He doesn't sign declarations. What he does is far more difficult. He listens, he walks, and he refuses to look away. In a world where the powerful often drown out the powerless, Issa proves that dignity, quiet, humble dignity, can shift the course of a nation. The beauty of this story lies in its restraint. There are no grandiose speeches, no explosive battles. Instead, there's a man who carries a crutch like a torch, a president who dares to unlearn his power, a people who discover their voice not through rage, but through remembering who they are. Perhaps what struck me most is Issa's final choice. He walks away from medals, from land, from titles. Why? Because peace to him is not found in wealth or recognition. It's found in knowing he helped others see themselves. He doesn't want a statue. He wants schools. He wants murals. He wants people to walk upright, not in his shadow, but in their own light. This is not just a story about politics or protest, it's about presence. It's about being seen. And ultimately, it's about love for people, for truth, for quiet acts of resistance. In a world addicted to noise, Issa reminds us that real courage is often invisible. And maybe that's the most revolutionary thing of all. So now I ask you, when was the last time you truly listened, not to respond, not to fix, but to understand? And if someone invisible stood in front of you today, would you see them? Let's talk about it in the comments. If this story touched, you don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.